The word socialism has crept into our political vocabulary more frequently in recent years. On the left, it's part of the phrase democratic socialism, an idea touted, for example, by Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. On the right, the term is used sometimes to stoke fears of government overreach. But how is socialism defined in 2019? And more importantly, how could it affect the 2020 presidential election? CBS News digital reporter Kathryn Watson set out to answer those questions, and she joins us now from Washington. Kathryn, it was so refreshing to see your article today on CBSNews.com, because I'd been thinking recently that in what we've been seeing from politicians, both on the left and the right, are a co-opting of terms that sometimes are not clear to the people, to the American people, why they're being used and what they actually mean. We sometimes forget the things that we learned in our history classes in high school and in college and react to the language that popular politicians use. So in your piece, you give a couple of different definitions of socialism because of the fact that that term has been used differently by people at different times. So take us through a couple of those definitions.
Sure. Well, the basic definition of socialism, if there can be one, which is very much up for debate, is the government owning and operating the means of production. Now, that has taken on various forms through the years, but what we're really talking about now in 2019, I spoke with a number of self-described socialists or democratic socialists, and what they came to the conclusion of or explained to me was that what we're talking about today is really generally a more generous welfare state. We're looking at places more like what we might see in Europe, Denmark or Iceland, for example, and that's what we're talking about more than perhaps what Republicans are talking about when it comes to Venezuela and socialism. So really what we're seeing is the definition or description of socialism is very different amongst Democrats versus Republicans, but then also within the Democratic Party, the definition of socialism in 2019 here in America is something that is very much up for debate.
Yeah, so what I find really fascinating is I wonder sometimes if the term is being misused or misappropriated because as you say, what you've started to see is people, when they talk about socialism and they talk about Bernie Sanders or they talk about Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez or Elizabeth Warren, they say, if you want what's happening in Venezuela to happen here in the United States, vote for those candidates. And what your article points out is that there are certain countries in the world, and you point to some Scandinavian ones. I spent most of my life in France, which has a very socialist democratic republic.
Right.
But as you also point out, you spoke to a couple of economists, those democratic socialist states are very, very expensive to live in because they tax people at a very, very, very high rate. They're popular, but they're expensive. So in the case of France, which on one hand has considered by the World Health Organization one of the best healthcare programs in the world, right? But it's super expensive to live there, and people are taxed to the hilt. And the French government spends 11.5% of their GDP on healthcare, which is 4 times as much as they spend on defense.
Absolutely. And really what we're talking about right now, certainly with the Democratic primaries, is how generous should those benefits be? Medicare for all is obviously a very big topic, hot topic right now for Democratic contenders looking into 2020. I think it's going to become, and already has become, a litmus test for many in the Democratic Party. Bernie Sanders and others, of course, are saying this is what we have to do. Medicare for all is going to be pricey if it were something that the U.S. would pursue. Upwards of $30 trillion is what we're talking about. So what kind of effect would that have on the economy is something that is certainly going to have to be addressed. Nancy Pelosi even said in an interview recently with Rolling Stone, well, how do we pay for that? It's a question that's going to have to be answered.
It's a fascinating article, and you talk to some economists who essentially say to people, look, you can call it what you want, but what you're really talking about is a welfare state when it comes to democratic socialism, and some people in this country don't want to see that either. And it may not necessarily be what's going on in Venezuela or in Cuba or even in China, but it is something that will cost Americans a lot more than they are spending now. So I point our viewers to that piece. I'm glad you were able to join us to break it down for us. We appreciate it as always, Kathryn. Thank you.
Thank you, Vlad.